thinking that I won't react. You whispering my name, thinking I won't be the same. Turn fiction into fact. See what you didn't know, bruises that I'll never show, slipping on your every jab. So tighten up your fist, step into the ring with this. I hope your mama's got your back. First round, you thought you would've knocked me down. Fifth round, bleeding out the side of your mouth. Final round, holding the sound of my name in the crowd. You didn't bust. Oh, 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 oh. You didn't bust. Oh, 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 oh. Just 'cause I took a break, you're making a huge mistake, thinking you can take the throne. Look at you trembling, step into the lion's den. Bet you wish you stayed at home. Begging for mercy underneath your breath when I ain't even sweating yet. My legend's written in the stone, yeah. You're crying danger in defeat is now your only friend. Even your mama's gotta know. First round, you thought you would've knocked me down. Fifth round, bleeding out the side of your mouth. Final round, holding the sound of my name in the crowd. You didn't bust. Oh, 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 oh. You didn't bust. Oh, 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 First round, fifth round, final round. Oh, yeah. First round, fifth round, final round. No, 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 no. First round, you thought you would've knocked me down. Fifth round, bleeding out the side of your mouth. Final round, holding the sound of my name in the crowd. You didn't bust. Oh, 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 oh. You didn't bust. Oh, oh, oh,
Hello, hello. Welcome everyone to In Time. I'm going to just double check and make sure I'm not muted. Unplugged and replugged in all the hardware. Had a hardware failure. Everything had to go, come back in. But everything tells me you can hear me, but that doesn't mean anything. And since I trust the live chat about as much as I can throw them, I'm probably getting 16 people going like, what, Nick? Huh? We can't hear. So I'm just going to assume my instruments are accurate. Xandering, how you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. Spending a little bit of quality time at home.
Nice. I keep forgetting. Just it's like I get to see my wife every day, and she was out on a conference for a little while, so she goes to these conferences all over the place. Used to take me, but I'm a writer, so I figure these are professional conferences. I need to practice my craft, which is making shit up. So I would just I'd forge a new identity, say CIA. And, I'd show up there and you're CIA? Oh, I'm sorry. That's supposed to read guest. It wasn't supposed to read CIA. Don't just pretend I'm not here and just see how long I can get away with that shit. But she doesn't invite me to the conferences anymore, which is a bummer because it's like Hawaii and all these other places. So, but anyway, she went, and I was, and I ain't kidding. I've told the story before. Now is not the time. But she was gone for a week, and then I was just really thinking about, like, you don't realize, she's gone for a week, and I was just like, you guys don't get to see each other for so I'm glad you got to spend a little time at home.
Yeah, this year's been a little rougher too. I've been gone a little bit more frequently. So, yeah, we got home. The wife's, I think she told me she was going to watch. I'm actually in my truck right now, just so that we don't get any interruptions. But I am staring right at my house, so she better be watching. She better type something in the live chat, tell me that she's watching.
Well, and so
yeah. So.
A lot's been going on. I think we're gonna wait unless there's real breaking news. We're gonna wait for overtime before we really get into the news. But the what's happening in Ukraine is now saying that they think an invasion is imminent. Now, of course, they're incentivized to say that. That may or may not be true. But Biden has had orders drawn up. We don't know much about the orders. We do know that they're for deployments, but it looks like they're deployments within NATO. But if that's true, then that means NATO has orders drawn up. So nothing's been signed that we're aware of, but this has been creating a whole bunch of and people have been confused about, well, he's signed orders. No. Well, he's deploying the army. No. But the orders are drawn up, and that's not insignificant. So we're keeping an eye on that. If there's breaking on it, we'll go to breaking. But short of that, we'll probably just cover it tomorrow overtime, 9 p.m. Eastern. So I hope you guys can all join us for that. In the meantime, you and I have talked, as Andrew, and both of us are very pro-science, and we're very pro people who know more than we do, and that represents basically everybody probably at the master's level and above quite easily in this regard. But you are the kind of person who always tries to think about the other side, and that's something that we've seen a lot of, and I've been very thankful for. And you and I keep talking about it. You keep bringing up a point, which is, well, gee, Nick, we keep pretending like this is going to do nothing to the economy, and people get worried about the economy are, just idiots or assholes or all this stuff. And that's not true. And you're right. It isn't true. None of that's true. And one of the things that I've said before is the economy is lives. In some cases, property is lives. It's true. A home isn't as important as a human life. You can rebuild the home. But sometimes if the home has the only dialysis machine inside it, and somebody needs that to live, all of a sudden that home does become a life. So it's not quite as simple as the words that we throw around all the time. Those are great. I mean, I use those expressions. They're great, and you can say a lot with them. But there's more nuance to that, and there are people on the other side of the equation. Now, we never did a full lockdown in the U.S. By most of us say, well, we locked down, or there was sort of half lockdowns in some states that almost kind of thought about it in terms of an actual lockdown. No, we didn't do it. Should we have done it? What would have happened if we had done it? There's still people coming in from other countries. Could we have stopped it? New Zealand was very successful for a while and then failed. Could we have repeated it? Should we have tried? And would doing nothing have been better than maybe, as you had said, which I really liked, doing half solutions and getting the worst outcome of each of them? We took a serious hit to the economy, and we're still flooded with COVID. We managed to botch this to high hell. So what could we have done? What should we have done? Would really just ignoring it have been, at least better for the economy and not that many more infected? So these are all really good questions. And the guy that we know best to answer this would be Homozygote. So we asked him on, and he graciously said that he would arrive. So tonight we have with us Homozygote to help us try to make sense of some of these questions. Homozygote, how are you?
Not too bad. Just trying to stay warm in very cold Vermont. The wind chill is kind of kicking my ass a little bit. So just trying to stay cozy.
Yep. The weather's been, and I should let me see. I'm going to see if it'll go for that on the shot. It did. Oh, perfect. What do you know? Like I said, I don't trust any of the buttons anymore because I unplugged everything. It took me hours to get things back, and even then, at least one of the computers isn't connected. But we'll worry about that some other time. Well, so welcome, and I do want to, I think, start sort of as a premise, of course, again, that we're all really on the same team, and we're all really do agree that it's going to take some significant measures to stop this thing that is serious. But how serious? I mean, the death numbers are reasonably low. What do we know about it, and what is these complete lockdowns that people have proposed and obviously now can never happen, a solution? And if theoretically we could make them happen now, would it be worth it, and what would it take? So let's start to get into it. But I'm just going to sort of pass this off to Xandering, because he's the one who really came up with a lot of, I thought, really good questions, and I think we should discuss. So Xandering, it's all yours.
Sweet. Now I'm on the hot seat. So if I make a complete fool of myself, nobody can blame me but me.
Oh, well, first of all, I blame you when I make a fool of myself. So that's just but you are a little crackly. I don't know if you can fix that. We can certainly understand you. So don't try to fix it at the cost of. I'd noticed that earlier and I forgot to mention. So you're a little crackly. I can understand you. I assume Homozygote can. So if it's something that you feel like you can address easily, great. If not, let's just go forward.
I'm not entirely sure what I would do. I mean, this is a headset. It either works or it doesn't. Doesn't have
now,
really.
So I scolded the headset. It got a little, so now it's straightened up. You're welcome.
Okay.
All right. So it's all you.
Yeah, I don't think I have any. So yeah, I had some questions because I hear like the current administration making claims like we're going to end COVID and things like this, and it's like I don't see how any of that's possible, and I think that we're getting painted into a corner, and I hear very little concern for things like the economy, and as much as lives matter, I'm not saying that people don't matter, but I'm saying that nature is a cruel and unloving beast, and the world is a cruel and unloving place, generally speaking. And there's quite a lot of risks, and we need to bring all of the risks in together. I've heard a lot of people talking, some very far right, some very far left, some people more in the middle that wanted to take kind of a more balanced approach. I think we kind of took a kind of balanced approach where we got the worst of everything. I don't think that we did well. And I would prefer to figure out kind of where exactly I stand, because I've been kind of floating around the middle of this going, okay, I can see good points, and I see good points on both sides. So I was hoping to get to talk to somebody who's got a more understanding of virology or pandemics than I do. I play one on TV or on YouTube, I should say. I play an economist on YouTube, and that's about the extent of my experience. So not super high. So I want to. There's some arguments that I've heard that I would like to, I don't know if I buy them, but I think I can make them convincingly, or at least make a good show of the arguments. And I'd like to get kind of what your responses to these things are. Maybe some of them are ridiculous and I'm just not seeing the whole picture. So I guess we'd start with the beginning of the pandemic. I was kind of on board with quite a lot of the things that started at the very beginning of the pandemic, although I was a little hesitant at first to think it was much more than something like maybe swine flu or avian flu that came through. Didn't have a whole lot of information when it first started coming out, then things started building. And I've seen this pattern repeat a couple of times now with some of the variants that have come out too. It seems like there's quite a high sensationalism. Low actual information, low facts, quite a lot of speculation going on. Then as we move forward, and it started off kind of as we didn't want to overwhelm the healthcare system. So we wanted to try and put in some measures, social distancing, mask wearing, some of these things. Let's not have large indoor venues and things because we wanted to flatten the curve. We didn't want to overwhelm the healthcare system. That makes a lot of sense to me. I get that. I understand. Let's do that. I'm all for that. And of course, at this point, there is no vaccine. There has never been a SARS vaccine successfully produced up to this point. So there's quite a lot of speculation as to whether there actually will be one for this. So at the very beginning, it was expected that probably a large number of people were going to get this, and at least the rhetoric that I heard, or the talking points that I heard, was that these things were supposed to flatten the curve. I was okay all the way up to that. Then they kind of shut half the country down because it was suddenly, this is really, really a dangerous virus. I'm not entirely sure that they had quite the evidence to support all of that when they really started some of the shutdowns. But early on, I was kind of, okay, let's see how this I don't know a lot about this. I've never been through a pandemic, at least one that really affected the United States. I mean, there was the swine flu pandemic or epidemic. I don't know if it really made pandemic, but so I'd seen some of it on TV that had affected other areas. So I was really unsure. And then as things went on and on and on, it seemed to me that things started getting a little bit more and more and more ridiculous. There was specifically the virus seemed to target or was particularly bad on certain demographics, like elderly people with high comorbidities. The overall death rate, percentage-wise, wasn't huge. It's not like we had everybody getting Ebola or rabies. Thankfully, that would be terrible. But we kept extending this more and more and more. And I just kind of felt like this was being horribly mishandled. And of course, everybody blamed Trump for everything that was going wrong, because at this point, Trump is still president. But then we had the vaccine come out, and the vaccine showed to be fairly effective, seemed to be pretty safe, awesome new technology, medical breakthrough, mRNA vaccine. This is cool. It became available. They started pushing it out. And then once it became, and the lockdowns didn't seem to really stop anything either, the quote-unquote lockdowns that we had, the reduced economic. The federal government pushed a hell of a lot of money into the economy. Some of it went to, a very small amount of it went to individuals to help them. Most of it went to kind of the economy, corporations in general. Wasn't a fan of that either, but to keep the economy kind of chugging along and not fully collapse. And there just seemed to be a complete disregard.
Trillion, I think, if I remember correct, I think the final total was about 5 trillion, which is a staggering number. So yeah, okay, sorry, but then we'll give Homozygote a chance.
That's good. Yeah. But once they released it showed to be effective at least preventing serious injury or death, high numbers, or serious sickness and death, high numbers, and then we move on to Omicron. Omicron comes out and kind of changes everything, because it doesn't matter if you're vaccinated or not, you're probably going to get Omicron. It's that infectious. But doesn't seem to be doing all that much damage as far as serious illness, death, or even long COVID for that matter. And it's come now, we've gotten all the way kind of up to today, where it's like most people that I hear talk about this are like, yeah, everybody's going to get it. You should be vaccinated. And and then we have arguments over, vaccine mandates versus non-vaccine mandates. And I've kind of gotten to the point, it's like you have a virus or you have a vaccine available. Most people are going to be fine, even if they get it, especially now that we have Omicron. Why is this still kind of a pandemic? Why is this still a thing? Why are we still inhibiting the economy? Why do we have all of these things still going on? If you're concerned about getting the virus, good news, there's a vaccine. Has a really good chance of reducing your serious illness, hospitalization, and death. Probably won't stop you from getting it. But why do you care if I had it or not? I mean, my life isn't really your concern. And that's kind of the argument that the anti-people saying, no, you can't mandate vaccines and things like that. It's kind of the argument they're making. And so I just kind of wanted to it's like, I'm stuck here going, this was a shit show, and a hell of a lot of damage is done, because I don't think we really saved a whole hell of a lot of lives. The stuff that we put in place, I don't think really, maybe I'm wrong. Tell me if I'm wrong. I don't feel like we did a huge, tremendous effort of saving a whole bunch of people's lives from dying of it. And at the same time, we have done quite a lot of damage to the economy. We're starting to see some of that. And unfortunately, the kind of damage that we've done to the economy has caused ripples through the entire economy. And we haven't even seen the end of the ripples. So we don't even know exactly where all of this is going to end up and exactly the extent of the damage, because sometimes those ripples kind of peter out. Sometimes they turn into tsunamis. So nobody seems to care about that. And I just kind of wanted to get your take on, should we have done something different? Was any of this effective?
Well, I'd like to point out that these are pretty common questions, and one of the differences is that it's like these. I think this is the core of what people are worried about. So thank you, Xander. So yeah, Homozygote, take it away, please.
All right, so there's a pretty good amount to unpack there. I guess I'll Start at the very beginning of the pandemic. Yeah, the lockdown quote unquote lockdown that we had was really not the most complete nor robust lockdown. I would use the country of New Zealand as a model for how to properly lock down. The benefits of locking down, like you said before, were one, to prevent the healthcare system from being completely overwhelmed. And two, what most people don't also really interpret when they think about lockdowns was that at least at the very beginning of the pandemic, the benefit that the lockdown has would be to establish, one, developing actual tests for the virus so we can test people to see if they have it or not. And two, to establish robust contact tracing systems. So that way we have an idea of, okay, if there's an outbreak in a particular community, who's a close contact, who do we need to quarantine? All of that can, again, circle back around to the notion of flattening the curve to try and keep the healthcare systems from being overwhelmed. And that is precisely the strategy that New Zealand took at the start of the pandemic. And they took that and they ran with it and adopted it for their, over the entire pandemic strategy of basically zero tolerance for COVID. Not necessarily zero COVID, because at the contagious rate that all the variants we're getting are going, it's going to be pretty impossible to reduce all COVID to just zero. But you can minimize it. I would certainly not categorize New Zealand's effort as a failure by any stretch. I think at their worst, they've had like 75 cases per day on a 7-day running average. So if you compare that to the American numbers, where at one point in time, 5 to 10% of the entire US population had Omicron at any given moment, that is statistically overwhelmingly in favor of New Zealand's response. So I would say a model like New Zealand, where there is a collective effort taken both by the government and the populace working in conjunction to try and keep communities safe and virus free, is an ideal model because it reduces the amount of A, suffering and loss of life, and B, New Zealand can have, to many extents, a functional economy where people are alive, they can spend money, they can buy products and services. There were points in time where New Zealand was at zero COVID, they had 0 cases, and they were holding concerts. They were quote unquote back to normal. So at that point, that is more or less proof in the pudding that taking a very early, aggressive, and decisive response can have long-term benefits, and they're still reaping those benefits to this day. Even in the face of the most contagious COVID variant that we've ever had, they're still doing pretty okay, right? You can maybe argue their geography and their population density position them well, but with how contagious Omicron is, those variables mean a whole hell of a lot less now than they ever have before. So now if we kind of turn the lens back in with respect to the American response, it's very much public knowledge at this point that the Trump administration was suppressing the CDC insofar as COVID briefings very early on in the pandemic. There were issues within the CDC in terms of developing our own COVID tests, in terms of the technical details. They made a bunch of rookie mistakes that undergraduates in college really wouldn't have made. So that's certainly a failing on their part. But I would also question the idea that anybody expecting everybody or a large swath of people to get any pandemic illness, regardless of what it is, as being a valid perspective. Like anybody who's saying, oh, well, we should just let people get it, or a ton of people are probably going to get this. Let's just let it happen and let the cards fall where they fall. That is, I think, a short-sighted perspective insofar as its effects on communities and even the individual person thinking about that, right? We're still seeing the effects to this day of people not being able to go out, spend money, buy goods and services because their communities are so ridden with virus that they are in a situation where they, again, like work is unsafe, staying home is unsafe, going to the grocery store is unsafe, going to a bar or restaurant, everything is so unsafe. So allowing... Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just wanted to, and that was actually, and we learned sort of after the fact, that was actually the Trump's official policy was even though the CDC was recommended lockdowns and aggressive approach, the Trump administration did come up with their official policy, which was herd immunity. The idea that you actually want to get as many people to get it as, and for herd immunity to work, you don't have to aggressively try to do it, but that was actually what they decided they were going to do, which explains a lot of their activities in trying to get people to, it was basically a pox party. But so I want to make that clear too, so that we're on the same page. So that was an actual strategy that was soundly rejected by the CDC and scientists, as I recall, but that was the strategy adopted by the Trump administration. I apologize for interrupting.
No, you're fine. I mean, you'd be surprised. It wasn't so much rejected by the CDC as rejected by all of the people underneath Trump CDC director Robert Redfield. It's worth noting that Trump CDC director is a lab leaker and himself was also in favor of the herd immunity strategy. So it's not like we're talking about just the White House, just the executive branch, not having a normal one when it comes to trying to understand science. It was their literal CDC director. So, at all levels of response, the people in charge were certainly choosing the incorrect choices, and all of us are left to suffer the consequences of those choices. So let me touch on a few other things that are said. Right, I think we're in terms of the timeline transitioning into the summer, things calm down for a moment, and then sort of in the fall and the winter things peak again. We get the vaccines, which are overwhelmingly safe and effective.
I agree. I just want to be clear. Changes. I agree with you on that.
Yeah, I know. It's just worth repeating. The Biden CDC made a fatal flaw with trying to incentivize the unvaccinated by telling people to take off their masks once they had their vaccines, because they did not have the full scientific proof that the vaccines prevented any and all infection, but rather a majority of them. And that fact still holds true today, even in the face of Omicron, if you're triple vaccinated. So if you have 3 Pfizers, 3 Modernas, or some combination of mRNA, Johnson & Johnson, right, you still have a 70% efficacy in preventing any Omicron infection. Like, that's kind of where we're at. And I say this in light of the news that Pfizer is running an accelerated trial for an Omicron-specific booster as of today, and they're already producing said Omicron-specific booster at risk, meaning if it doesn't work out, they just produced a bunch of useless vaccine. They expect that to be ready at the beginning of March. So we have essentially now a pipeline where finally, at long last, we can take advantage of the critical feature of the mRNA vaccine technology in changing it up for new variants as we get new variants. It took a fair amount of time for data to be collected to suggest that that might be necessary, but those data are in to some degree. There will obviously be more data coming through. But all of that to say, we have the tools and everything needed to actually fully suppress the virus and drive case counts down. And I think the administrations, both of them, have unfortunately relied solely on vaccination as the only tool. Vaccination is a great tool. It absolutely prevents transmission. It absolutely prevents people from getting severe disease, being hospitalized, or dying. But at the same time, both with natural infection and with vaccination, right, immunity wanes to a degree. Like, that's why we're on possibly 4 shots now, is because the immunity in terms of antibody levels doesn't always stick around, right? We have enough data to suggest that with 3 shots, your immunity with respect to getting Omicron or not wears off after about 3 months. And this is just a feature of the immune system. It's not a problem with the vaccine technology. This is just biology at this point. So we kind of have to combat and reconcile that in how we combat the virus. We can't solely rely on vaccination because immunity is going to wax and wane, almost like the moon, as people get vaccinated every so often. So that raises the question, okay, well, what do we do? Because if we're in this awkward middle ground where we feel like the economy is not being very well supported, and we're still kind of pushing vaccinations, and then we have this variant to deal with, and the administration seems to be pretty content to just let it rip and get it over with, what should we do? So obviously there's more than just vaccination, and these are the same old tools that we've known about the entire pandemic: mask wearing, distancing, reducing the amount of congregation. What's, I think, been underutilized and underemphasized is improving ventilation in public spaces. Even a country like Japan, who is still actually now dealing with an Omicron spike of their own, they at least have more effort to ventilate their public spaces. They have CO2 sensors and improved ventilation systems in a lot of their restaurants, their bars, their shopping centers, places like that. I think the reason why the U.S. is kind of stuck in this middle ground is because the people in charge do not want to commit the resources to make these tangible improvements, to make the strategy to combat the virus more comprehensive, right? We don't have the resources to do contact tracing. Essentially, all powers have given up on that. Public health has been underfunded in this country for many, many years at both the state and federal level. The CDC itself has been serially underfunded. with respect to our literal ability to gather up medical and scientific resources to fight the virus, we're playing from behind. We've not had the money to actually do what's needed to be done, right? We didn't invest in ventilation. We have just barely gotten around to scrounging up rapid tests to send 4 of them to everybody for free, along with some masks, if we're lucky. Right, like we're doing everything very reactively. We've done nothing proactively. So I think the solution is not necessarily to just sort of lift all the restrictions and relent, but rather we still have an opportunity to take all of these tools that we know about to clamp down until case counts go down, and to continue to push boosters as a way to make sure that transmission in communities are reduced and that case counts go down. Now, to really bring this full circle, I think with respect to the economy, I would argue the people in charge are very much acting in favor of the economy right now, especially in the light of the recent CDC quarantine guideline change, which did not contain a testing out of quarantine requirement. They allegedly did this at the request of Delta Airlines after their chief medical officer and CEO sent the CDC director a letter asking for a test out of quarantine policy that could allow people to get back to work sooner than the current or the previous 10-day quarantine requirement. You combine that with the fact that we have literally the president tweeting things out like our economic recovery is going awesome, like the economy is great, in the face of mass resignations, in the face of a lack of quality jobs available, in the face of remarkably unsafe environments for people to work in. It seems like there's a very large gap in terms of the material conditions needing to be addressed. And so I think the solution to actually get the economy back on track, which should have been something that was done from the very start of the pandemic, and this is something that Canada and New Zealand have both done, is to pay people to stay home. Right. When there are lockdowns, when there are restrictions which are needed, you have to make people whole. You can't just lock everything down and then just say, oh, well, if you lose your job, you lose your job. Like, you're screwed, but at least you'll be alive. Okay, you'll be alive, but being alive is not going to be very fun if you're homeless or bankrupt or both. So you have to couple policy that addresses material conditions with the scientific policy insofar as lockdowns and gathering restrictions. So that's a large deficiency of the U.S. policy, is we did not pay people to stay home. We did not keep businesses upright until we had the PPP, that program. And I think about 75% of that money went to businesses and 25% went to workers to keep them from losing their job, which results in a lot of people losing their job. And on top of that, we had stimulus checks that were very haphazardly scattered across both administrations to keep people upright and help them stay propped up. So we're kind of getting this attitude from both administrations, and the current one especially, that they're virtue signaling about the economy, but they're really not actually doing anything to address the core problem of the virus is still spreading. People are getting sick. People have to take time off work. That's causing supply chain disruptions. That's sending ripples through the stock market. Like, it's the virus itself that is causing this. The root cause of all of these economic woes is allowing the virus to spread unchecked. And those economic woes are going to continue until case counts go down. We have the tools. We have the science. We have all of the information that we need. Like, this isn't new. Like, we've known all these things for a very long time. It's the core of what you're getting at, Sandering. It's political willpower. We lack, unfortunately, the political willpower to try and make our society better in the long term, right? We have this very short-sighted, hyper-capitalistic mentality insofar as, okay, let's just send everybody back to work right now. If they get Omicron, they get Omicron. It's a little bit more mild. They're not going to die as much. Okay, cool, fine. Just send it. That's their attitude, and that's not clearly working, as you said, right? The stock market's not happy. People are still feeling economic woes. So, we have to address material conditions. But when the political people in charge don't have a vested interest in doing that, when their sights are solely on short-term profit, they do not see the long-term impact that allowing the virus to continue to spread has. And the impact that they're now going to see, that we're already starting to see in European countries, is that we're now getting a subvariant of Omicron displacing the original Omicron from countries like Denmark and now the UK. Mild, not mild, that's still to be determined in a Omicron to Omicron comparison. But the virus is still doing what it's going to do. And if you let it spread unchecked, you are creating the most ripe environment to prolong all of these economic woes, to prolong all of these mutations, these variants that might come out of left field, right? You're increasing the odds that none of this is going to work. So rather than just ripping off a Band-Aid and saying, all right, everybody just suck it up, you're going to get it. Here's a couple of tests if you're lucky, maybe some masks. We can actually bring case counts down. This is viable. New Zealand is doing pretty damn well right now. They're, I think, a pretty ideal model for what zero COVID tolerance looks like. Now, I think to address the final microscopic elephant in the room, because this is a very common question that people have with respect to Omicron in particular, right? It's more mild. Am I going to die or not? Is this just a common cold at this point? Can I just get it and then move on with my life? So here's what we know. Omicron, in comparison to Delta, is less mild when it comes to death and when it comes to usage of the ICU. But that's where it ends, right? The more mild ends there, because mild, again, is a clinical indicator in the proper scientific sense of needing to be in the ICU on a ventilator. We've seen hospitals flooded with people not necessarily needing to go to the ICU, but needing supportive care in the emergency room, in the COVID ward, and that is translating to other excess deaths due to strain on the medical system, the very thing we were trying to prevent in the very beginning of the pandemic. And that's also translating to this very cavalier attitude that is allowing the elderly, those with comorbidities, even while they're vaxxed, the immunocompromised, to get Omicron. And those people are actually dying of Omicron. The CDC director actually said that out of all of the vaccine breakthrough cases, 75% of them were people with comorbidities. Like, we also have to keep in mind that these people's lives matter and have value. And there might be people who just get unlucky. I mean, people think that I have an immune system, it's mild, I'll be fine, I'll live. Sometimes the immune system loses. Like, everybody who's ever died of COVID has had an immune system. Just because you have it doesn't mean it's going to work and actually beat the virus. I wouldn't give it the chance, and that's why I advocate for vaccines, right? And I think that's why you do the same as well, because the data are pretty clear at this point. But all of this to say, with respect to Omicron being more mild, it's still more severe than every other variant aside from Delta. And that much we also know in terms of the data. So I would be very hesitant to let something rip that we know is more severe than everything else except for Delta, more severe than the original virus, more severe than Alpha, more severe than any of the other variants that have been bouncing around the planet. I would be very hesitant to let that rip with how incredibly transmissible it is, right? We don't have perspective on long COVID yet. There are some recent studies talking about some damage and maybe some biomarkers to really identify people with long COVID, but long COVID is still very ill-defined, even if people live, right? Even if there's a 99% survival rate, quote unquote, depending on your age bracket and your medical conditions, long COVID is still possibly going to be a scourge. We might be crippling an entire generation if we're talking about kids and Gen Z who are in schools right now and they're all practically getting it. Like, what are they going to look like in terms of their physical health, in terms of their brain development, which doesn't even end until 25? Like, we have to really be aware that long COVID is a thing. It's very much under advocated for. Like, people don't really consider it. They only view the binary, live or die. There's a lot in between, right? Even if you get it, you survive. Your quality of life might be so disastrous that you might wish that the virus took you out in the first place, especially in the American healthcare system. You want to talk about economic woes. If you need to go to a doctor to figure out your long COVID, you're going to be paying a pretty penny for that, especially if you don't have good health insurance. So I know that was kind of a lot, but I think in a lot of the things that you brought up, there's certainly a lot to unpack there. So, all of that to say, I think the real core of the economic problems is the lack of political willpower to control the virus and letting the virus do whatever it wants, because when the virus does whatever it does, more people are going to get sick, immunity is going to wane, we might get another variant in the future that might prolong this entire thing. And the more of that happens, the more job loss, the more people calling out sick, the more businesses that are going to crumble, the more that our collective economic function is going to further collapse. I would argue it really wasn't in great shape prior to COVID, but that's a separate discussion.
All right. Well, let me
agree with you on that, but I think Nick had a question.
and I want to just try to give a little form here to all of this. So the real question is consequences versus risks, right? And we're going to ask, one of the things is, and we have this problem with the show, is everybody who watches the show watches primarily because they like to operate with as many facts as possible. And we're an educational channel. We try to give you the facts. And we don't have a lot of facts with COVID, and the facts keep coming in, and then the facts keep changing because a new variant comes out. So we're going to talk about what would have happened if, but we have to keep in mind that's based on things we now know, and we didn't have facts then. But my question is going to be what would have happened if. It's a terribly unfair question for the very reason that we did not know then. So we had to assume that this could be 10 times worse than it really is, and we have to, so, anytime we have any kind of threat to individuals, to the country, to anything like that, we have to make a threat assessment. So I am going to ask about what if, and we're going to do that. And that's also a dangerous game because it's all guesswork, right? But I do think that there are people who are making the argument that, hey, if we had done nothing, would have been fine. And I'm not sure that's true. So I'd like to play a little what if for a minute. And then the other thing is, I'd like to talk about, and just to as a separate aside that I'm sure we're going to go back to, beside the fact that I think talking about a UBI and what we could have done for the economy, we spent a tremendous amount of money, and it feels like we're not seeing anything for it. It always feels that way, and it's hard to tell, but I'd like to get into that. UBI, that. But the other thing is, I would like to talk about what we do and don't know about COVID, and it seems to me that the goal in slowing down COVID is to reduce hospitalizations, reduce deaths. That, of course, we have to worry about what the death numbers are, and they look, kind of low as a percentage, 1%. A lot of people are like, well, if I get this, I got a 99% chance of, wait a minute. But so deaths, but also hospitalizations and the consequences of that and the increase in deaths from that. Also, we don't know long COVID. We don't know the effects on the brain. We don't know the effects on the kidneys. What is it? What was the other one? And also new variants. Of course, the more people who get it, the faster new variants come out. There's no way to predict what can happen, but all of life is a wager. There are always risks. So I think that's a summation of the risks of letting COVID go forward. So now let's talk about what if we had decided at the beginning, let's say, to say, here's what we're going to do. We're not going to shut anything down. We're going to keep everything going. Now, this is a virus, and it's more dangerous than other ones, so we are going to do a nationwide mask mandate. Everyone's going to have to wear a mask. Once they discover that Omicron really gets through the base masks, they upgrade that and say everyone has to wear the N95 mask. But until then, they're wearing kind of the old masks. They say social distancing is highly recommended, and maybe even some states go so far as to say that if grocery stores don't enforce it, they'll send in the police to enforce social distancing, which was a huge problem in the U.S. I mean, I was in a grocery store and it had all the social distancing guidelines, and nobody was following them. So they say we're gonna put instead of spending this $5 trillion we did, we're going to put $1 trillion in investments into improving airflow in various areas, and that's it. No lockdowns. Restaurants are going to have a bit of a problem because there are the social distancing, but they're going to have to do the alternate tables or whatever we're going to do. But that's it. We're not going to shut anything down. And as a country, we decided to do that instead of this piecemeal thing. And so if we did that. Really unfair question. What do you think that might have looked like from sort of beginning to now?
So let me I guess, repeat the question to make sure I'm understanding it correctly. If we basically decided to just, at the very beginning, let it rip and make some very light recommendations with respect to masking and distancing, is that accurate?
Yeah. Basically, the ones that sort of everybody agrees on, still people don't want to do because my freedom. But the ones that were like, okay, it's not going to cost the economy really anything to do this. We're not going to damage the economy, except for obviously again social distancing. We'll do some damage, but that's it, and let it rip aside from that. And the other thing aside that I forgot to mention too was, of course, we have to remember too that we make it sound like the goal of social distancing and of shutting down the economy is to sort of outlive COVID. No, it's to give us time to get the vaccines and find a solution to this. So it was never this, because we are going to be stuck with COVID. Probably it's going to be another flu is what it sounds like to me. We're always going to have it. There is no beating it. And so one of the questions is, well, if there's no beating it, what are we doing? But all that aside, because I put a lot there, let's just start with okay, we said we are going to have a nationwide mask mandate. Everyone's going to have to wear one. We are going to have social distancing, and basically that's it. What do you think would be looking at in general terms? You haven't sat down and done the math on this. I'm hitting you with it, so I'm aware this is off the cuff.
Yeah, I mean, if that was the scenario at the very beginning of the pandemic, we would have looked at a even more disastrous first wave than what we had. So we would have absolutely had the hospitals overrun, overflowing with cases, even with the sort of original ancestral version of COVID. Right, we're not even in variant land at this point. So that one was still relatively transmissible. People were still getting sick and dying in droves. I mean, I think I just watched the movie The First Wave, which I would actually recommend to anybody. It's following healthcare workers as they responded to the very first wave of COVID in New York in a particular hospital. But some of the statistics I remember from that movie, there were still, with what we did, around 700 something plus people dying a day in New York due at the very beginning. Like they were eclipsing 9/11 in a couple of days, every 2-3 days. So if we opted to do even less, then those numbers would have been astronomically bad in terms of death, especially in vulnerable groups. If you want to talk about elderly, immunocompromised people with other comorbidities, chronic medical conditions, those numbers would have been disastrous. What that would have looked like in children, we really wouldn't have necessarily known. Obviously, long COVID would have been a thing eventually. Like we would have made those same discoveries in terms of people having semi-permanent or permanent symptoms, or dealing with the permanent damage due to their infection in the first place. So even if we saw more cases and more deaths, we also probably would have noticed even farther down the line an increased incidence in long COVID simply because we let it rip. On top of that, we really, I think, would have, one, the hospitals would have been overrun, but two, the population of healthcare workers in particular, right? Because that was the biggest thing in this movie that I just watched. It followed the healthcare workers and how they were responding, how they were dealing with the tremendous grief and terror that they were going through, trying to deal with this in the first place. You would have gutted the entire population of healthcare workers in the country. Like if you want to talk about the medical system being unusable, even if case counts went back down eventually after the quote unquote first wave, the medical system would have been remarkably crippled because healthcare workers would have been quitting in even larger amounts than they are right now.
Well, and let me interrupt there for 1 second too. That's actually kind of what happened in Italy, right? When with the first wave that hit, Italy did actually, they were late, but they did do full lockdowns. But just on the lag on that, you had a much higher incidence of healthcare workers even just committing suicide. One of them had written that when she got home, she couldn't deal with burying any more children anymore because it still was hitting children, and she was watching people say goodbye to their parents, and so the effect on the healthcare system was utterly staggering, and they had taken much more precautions than that, but they did have, if I recall, the mask mandate and they still ended up with that kind of problem. If I recall, it's been a while, but that's kind of what I remember.
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, Italy took it very seriously in the very beginning. And they still had all of those issues, especially with healthcare workers trying to deal and cope. So, and that goes to show you the truly profound impact that the virus has, even at a sort of limited, blunted impact in the very first wave. If we just let that rip, we would have certainly been in a much worse position. I would also, I've probably rephrased the notion of, it's with us forever, it can't be beaten. We can. I think there's been a very large uptick of sort of it's endemic fatalism coupled with the misuse of the word endemic. At this point, again, like we already have all of the tools necessary to beat it. If we're talking about the first wave, we would have delayed the development of vaccines for sure. We probably would have delayed the clinical trials if society was so crippled that people couldn't actually function. Like you would have a difficult time trying to recruit people who didn't have COVID in the clinical trial. That was actually a problem that China had at some point, where so many people were vaccinated, sort of on the flip side of the coin, that they had a difficult time running clinical trials. We would have had the opposite problem. We wouldn't have been able to really test the vaccines because everybody has COVID and we can't compare, does this prevent you from getting COVID? Because a lot of people would have just had it. So, letting it rip has very clear, tangible consequences, but at the same time, too, we could have accelerated the development of variants, right? That's a consequence that's very unforeseen, that even today is still very difficult to predict. We could have accelerated the timeline that we got Alpha, that we got Delta. You look at India, for example. They are a country that is very poverty-stricken, and the virus had a lot of free reign, the ancestral original COVID, and Delta developed in that country. Delta ripped through India at a pretty disgusting pace and brought them to their knees, to the point where they were having funeral pyres in the streets because they couldn't handle all of the dead. We were in a similar position at the start, even with the lockdown and restrictions we did have, right? That movie, again, the first wave, you get to see the inside of the refrigerated trucks that they used to store the dead because the morgues were too full. So even as it stood right now, we were already about to break. Like, the healthcare system is already about to break. So if we just let it go, that really would have, I think, brought society to its knees, because car accidents, gunshots, unforeseen medical illness, like, nobody would have been able to interact with the healthcare system because hospitals would be full and there'd be no healthcare workers to run them. So yeah, in terms of the absolute sheer numbers, like you said, that's difficult to predict, but it would have been magnitudes worse. It genuinely would have been magnitudes worse.
So deaths on, and I don't want to, because I really want to hear, as Andrew has some other points, and I've heard some of his. He's got some. He's said a lot of interesting things that I really would love to discuss. So, but
sure.
So we're talking basically a 1%. Presumably mortality rate, but also unknown long haul COVID rates, but as high as 30% is what I've seen. Unknown permanence of symptoms, including brain fog, kidney issues, and obviously all the consequences of a hospital system far overwhelmed than what we saw. So we'll and then of course probably supply line because people are getting sick. So that 1% number doesn't seem like it's all that bad, especially it's actually not that far off from the flu. So it can but we're I'm sorry, I'm done. So please, as entering go, we do have a super chat, we'll get to it, but we have a couple other questions, but I really want to
go ahead and grab the super chat real quick.
Okay, I'll grab the super chat, and then we also just wanted to just so that our audience, because you'd think I'd have done this before and maybe know to ask this question up top. Homozygote, who are you, and what's your you're basically, you sit at your computer all day and just kind of read conspiracy paper. You're just a shill, man. Is that what's going on here? Could you tell us a little bit about who you are? But first, let me just read Sinister Porpoise, $5. Thank you so much for your support, Sinister Porpoise. Athena, her cat, who we've been graced with enough to see on a couple of occasions, believes that finished calculus homework is the tastiest. Apparently. Now, we all know she's taking calculus, and we all know the "my dog ate it" excuse, and she thinks she's come up with something original for her professor. Good luck with that. Good luck with the cat ate my homework. But thank you very much for your support and for your super chat. We wish you the best with your calculus. So who are you, Homozygote? And then we'll get right back into it.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a fair question. That's my internet handle, Homozygote. My name is Marcus. I'm a third-year PhD student at the University of Vermont. I have a bachelor's and master's in microbiology. I've taken all of the graduate-level immunology and virology classes, so I have a pretty big background in basically virology, immunology, and molecular biology. My current research is in neuroscience, so I do have a little bit of overlap when it comes to long COVID, brain fog, stuff like that. So I have a pretty big background in a lot of this, and I'm on the platform largely because I think the scientists as a whole don't do a very good job at communicating. So I like to be in online spaces like this to try and answer questions, or, like you said, combat conspiracy theories. I know we were reading earlier about some wacky papers about very interestingly funded research, but that's besides the point. I go over a lot of scientific data and I source everything I say. So I kind of function, like you said, I'm not at my computer all day, but I'm at my computer a decent amount of the time, insofar as following the latest and greatest scientific developments around the virus and trying to sort of read them, digest them, interpret them, and communicate them. That's kind of my station on Twitch.
Oh, we are going to have to. I can't believe I don't think we had this discussion. We may have. Well, we really want to do a show on bad studies that are funded, on diet. Xander had a great example of one on diet loss that was funded by a company that was just clearly, the data was just cherry picked. It was terrible. And so we'll see if that's something you're interested in. But anyways, going forward, and Xander, any other things that you wanted to ask about? I will, whatever you want, but I'll prime the pump with one of them, which was you had mentioned too, and I thought this was important. We're in COVID fatigue, right? And where's the hope? People are getting kind of, like we are going to be stuck with this all the time, and it seems like, and there's a thing to be said for, and it just seems like it's sort of failure everywhere. But I don't know. That was one that you had mentioned earlier that I really liked. But let me know where you want to go, Xander.
Yeah, no, I can talk about that really quick. You're a third-year PhD student. Did I hear that right? Well,
yeah.
Son of a bitch. Nick, you told me you were going to get me somebody who didn't have a clue what in the hell he was talking about, so that I could win this.
Is that why? Wait. What? Oh, it was a typo. I said was going to. How did that not get in there? I can see why you're so confused, Xandering. I am terribly sorry about that. Here's what I'm going to do. I finished all my water. I finished all my water, Xandering, so I'm going to go get myself some water. It's going to take about 10 or 15 minutes. There's no moderator here, no nothing. Have fun with the guy who knows what he's doing. I'll get back to you. You don't still have my home address, by the way, do you?
Yes, I do.
Oh, crap. Okay, well, I'll cross that bridge when we get to it. I'm going to bail for a minute. But
okay.
Yep, all right.
Yeah, I'll talk about one of the issues we're running into today. I guess I should talk about real quick. I'll preface this with some of the things that I do believe. I believe that the approach we took was the worst of everything. There's shockingly, for somebody who is more conservative, this is a realm. Pandemics is a realm where I believe that the federal government should have had a primary responsibility, should have been taking the primary role. The federal government specifically there to do the things that states either cannot or should not be doing themselves. When you look at all of the powers delegated to the United States by the Constitution, they're all things that you either can't have a state doing or you don't want a state to be doing. You don't want a state to be enforcing immigration law for the country. You don't want a state to be funding the military, even if they could. This is the realm where, it doesn't matter about state law or state boundaries, doesn't matter about country boundaries. This is something that's affecting everybody equally. It's not something you should expect a single state to be able to handle. So, ergo, I do believe that the federal government should have been the one. And if for some reason the federal government doesn't have the authority, which it does appear that the federal government is lacking in some authorities to do some of the things that should probably be done, and that you certainly recommend be done, such as mandating masks, then perhaps a constitutional amendment to specifically grant them the authority in cases of a global pandemic would be appropriate. Because I do think that is the appropriate place for a pandemic to be handled, is on a federal level. Of course, some people would argue that there was a pretty incompetent response on the federal level anyway, and even if they'd have had all of the power to control everything and not left it mostly up to the states, that we wouldn't have been any better off. Maybe we would, maybe we wouldn't. I'm not sure. Do you think that if the federal government would have been able to institute the policies and with the force of law, starting when it did, recognizing it was the Trump administration for the first year of this, do you think that there would have been a better overall outcome, or do you think we'd kind of still be where we are right now?
Well, I mean, there was proof that the Trump administration was trying to take a strong federal response in their policy of wanting to send every American a mask through the USPS. They wanted to send everybody a mask through the Postal Service, and then Trump himself got involved in that and wound up killing that policy. But at the very least, as god-awful as the Trump administration was, there was still at least some vested interest in engaging in public health at the level of the federal government. So they absolutely had the capacity to do it, and you could tell they had at least the intent when they drew up plans like that. So my hypothetical dream response, which is asking a lot of the Trump administration. I realize this, but it would have been decisive mask mandates, and when vaccines came out, vaccine mandates, coupled with the mask mandates early in the pandemic, pre-vaccine, distancing requirements, and probably improvements in ventilation. I'm saying that in hindsight because we really didn't know that at the time. But if I'm talking about what we could have done, knowing some of what we know now, masking and ventilation, along with social distancing, those three things would have really blunted a lot of the impact of the first wave. Now, I think on the notion that the federal government has some degree of authority, we just watched one federal agency in OSHA try to mandate vaccines under the grounds of what they've done before with other airborne, I don't want to say contagion, but airborne hazards. I think they used asbestos regulations as a precedent. And we watched the Supreme Court essentially shoot that down, saying states' rights, as in you can't force the states to do something. You're the federal government. They have rights, states' rights. So we're kind of experiencing the consequences of, Reagan-esque policy when it comes to, states' rights being code for, I want to say the N-word, and how all of that's really boiled down to the last 40 years of legal precedent that's neutered federal government authority in the name of states' rights. So that's a very political outcome that has hampered the federal government's ability to do what philosophically we both agreed should be done, insofar as them responding very decisively to a pandemic situation.
Yeah, and I can, we obviously agree on the pandemic issue. Obviously, I am for states' rights, and I think that the federal government does way more than it should be doing, and the states should be stepping up and doing a lot of the things that, not all of the things, obviously, but many of the things that the federal government does is best taken care of at a state level. That's just,
it'd be nice if
very
they did.
Conservative. Yeah, of course, sometimes, the argument is, well, if the states won't do it, then who is going to? Well, considering the authority lies with the states to do it, if they're not willing to do it, then I guess nobody will. I don't believe in empowering. Yeah, I don't believe in empowering the federal government to do something, simply because the states aren't doing it. I'm leery of the federal government doing things, so I don't think it does things particularly effectively or efficiently. But that's a different topic. We're talking about specifically COVID, where we do agree that, I believe that it is within the purview of the federal government to be dealing with something like that. So one of the issues I run into, and I see this, I go across this country all the time. That's what I do for a living. Everywhere that I have gone, I have to preface this with, I spend most of my time in travel centers, which means I am exposed to a disproportionate number of other truck drivers. And the truck driving community is already disproportionately conservative, Republican, right-wing. There's very few lefties in the trucking industry. They're there. Don't get me wrong, they are there, but they're a minority. So I'm already getting kind of a bias in selection just because I'm going to travel centers. However, there's a lot of other people that go to travel centers as well. They're not just truck stops anymore. There's a heck of a lot of people besides truck drivers going to travel centers now. They're specifically being catered to attract things like the RV crowd, the general public, traveling public. But I have to preface with there is a disproportionate number of truck drivers there. Everywhere that I go, including shippers, receivers, all of the truck driving places that I go, any restaurants that I go to, all around me, I see COVID fatigue. Everybody is complaining about the COVID stuff. There are very few people that I run into that even care about the virus anymore. I think that we kind of got the worst of everything when it comes to what kind of virus we actually got. I think we got the worst possible virus we could have gotten. It's not dangerous enough to kill large numbers of people, so it doesn't generate the kinds of, but dangerous enough to cause significant problems. I think long COVID is going to be a significant problem facing the country in the future. It's just enough of a death rate to make people stand up and go, ooh, that's not particularly good. But it's not enough of a death rate to scare enough of the population into being very strict about contagion control and viral spread. So I think we got the worst possible, one of the worst possible viruses that we could have gotten. So what do we do now that everybody's like, we've been dealing with this for over 2 years. It doesn't seem to be getting a whole hell of a lot better. The virus appears to be getting less lethal. There's debate on that, but the perception is that Omicron is not particularly dangerous, especially if you have gotten vaccinated. So how do you combat that now at this point? I mean, we are where we are, and we can't change what happened in the past. We can only look at what we need to do going forward. You have a population that I believe, this may be a bit biased, but I do believe is getting very frustrated and just over the COVID issues. You have some people that are still, such as yourself, pointing out, saying, no, look at the data. These are some bad ideas, and we should probably, fix this. And then you have a lot of other people, especially on the right wing, that are saying, look, the responsibility is now on the individual as to whether or not this is going to affect them or not, really. You have the availability to get a vaccine. The vaccines have been pretty dang successful. Go get one. Otherwise, go about your life. There's the virus is here. It's going to be here to stay. You're not getting rid of it. Stop with all of this, because you're causing a hell of a lot more damage to the economy, and you're not saving any other lives at this point. None of the policies are actually saving more lives. So, we've already built up quite a lot of damage, which to an economy that wasn't, I agree with you, particularly healthy before the pandemic. It had serious problems. And now we've just pumped over $5 trillion more into the economy. The economy is in a very fragile state, and if it collapses, I believe that a collapsed economy would kill more people in the United States than COVID has.
And let me just quickly add,
just because we're not prepared for that.
And you had pointed out, and this was, I think, a part of the problem now was when Biden said we're going to end COVID. And people said, "Oh, hey, wow, that's great to get elected." And if I'd rather have him dealing with COVID than Trump, so I'm glad he's elected. And if that helped, okay. But the problem is that's part of the COVID fatigue, right? It's like, wait, I thought we were going to end COVID, and it looks like that may not be happening. So, but I wanted to interject that as well. So I'm sorry, but please continue. So I think it was Homozygote was going to.
Yeah. So
what do we do now?
So, I mean, I think we could probably frame this somewhat differently. On the notion of COVID fatigue, and maybe my takes are a little radical, but even the people you encounter at the truck centers, I'm probably not describing those places correctly and not using the right terminology, but at those places where you travel, I mean, that's basically anecdotal evidence of what is being collectively felt, right? Everything is dragged on for so long that people are tired. Even people who are vaccinated, they think that, if I get two, I can go do whatever I want. COVID's not a thing anymore. I'm back to normal. Yet here we are now dealing with a variant that doesn't care if you've had two. It only cares if you have three, right? You might not necessarily die if you've gotten two and then you get Omicron, but you're still going to get it. And it's not going to be pleasant if you're taking unnecessary risk. So yeah, people are definitely fatigued, but that's a consequence of letting the virus spread, right? If there are fewer case counts, then people can go back to some degree of normalcy and engage in the things that they were doing beforehand. So in the absence of a strong and decisive federal government response, this is going to be the only outcome, especially when you have states such as Florida and Texas, whose governors basically decide they are pro-virus and want the virus to win and infect people and kill them with the policy that they're trying to implement. They're trying to prevent the implementation of mask mandates, vaccine mandates, other public health restrictions. I mean, I think even the state of Georgia on the state level introduced policy to remove vaccination requirements for all vaccines in some capacity, not just COVID vaccines, but for all of them. So there seems to be a great political angle when it comes to a lot of what people need to do to effectively combat COVID. Now, you brought up something that a lot of people definitely perceive insofar as people feeling like it's their personal responsibility, that the can has been kicked down to the level of the individual, and now it's on everybody else to get their life together and make decisions. And that's something that the Biden administration really heavily pushed, especially right before the first Delta wave in the summer of 2021, when they were saying, well, we've got vaccines, you can take off your mask, go back to normal. And, I think it was, again, the CDC director said something to the effect of, people should be making their own individualized assessments of scientific risk and making decisions based off of that, as if they're privy to the same information that the CDC director has. So,
well, and I haven't just FYI. I mean, I've got my stack of PhD peer-reviewed papers here, but I've only gotten into the top 3 or 4. I've just been a little busy, and every now and then I don't understand a little bit of the language. But yeah, no, I'll get to it. I'm a patriot. I'm going to read all of the scientific studies, and yeah, that's a good call. But please continue.
But on that point, people don't necessarily have the bandwidth nor the training to actually engage in things like that. And that's why there's a fundamental necessity for strong governmental responses, because we have multiple agencies, right? The NIH being a very scientifically mediated agency that facilitated the development of vaccines that went swimmingly well. And we have the CDC, which is supposed to be a public health agency that is supposed to function in the interest of public health. And I think across both administrations, that has suffered in a lot of respects due to a long variety of reasons. We could talk about that at a separate point. But look, right, we still have people in society that are disproportionately exposed to COVID. If we're talking about what we do from here on out, we still have people with comorbidities they had no control over. We still have people who are immunocompromised through no fault of their own. We still have children who are ineligible for vaccines. We are in a situation where we can't afford to simply just give up and move on and say 99% survival rate, let's just go back to normal, because we are still going to continue to add to the death toll, right? I mean, we're already at about 850,000 at least, and that number is probably going to eclipse 1 million by the time a lot of this is said and done. So, even at a 1% fatality rate, we still have had the most Americans die of any particular event in history. Like, this is more than the 1918 flu pandemic. This is certainly more than 9/11, more than a lot of wars combined, right? We have just scores of Americans dead, to the point where they're probably going to run out of room in front of the Washington Monument with the little white flags that they've been putting up to mark every COVID death. Like, they might have to move the memorial somewhere else at this rate. So, the solution isn't necessarily to just let people get it in the name of trying to get back to normal, because immunity wanes, the virus mutates. You're just prolonging the very thing that is creating the COVID fatigue in the first place. That's the value of a strong federal response, because it can bring people in cohesion with one unified strategy, one unified plan that states ideally would not have the authority to override or negate in whatever capacity that they do. When you have a cohesive response like that, case counts go down, people don't get sick, and people are more able to go work, to go spend time with their families, to go out and have fun, to go to concerts, enjoy their life. But we're at a point where nobody can really do that, because the pandemic is just perpetually going on and on and on. And for this foreseeable future, if this is how we act, we are increasing the risk that it just keeps going on. I mean, Omicron came out of left field. That was likely a consequence of not vaccinating enough people and not having enough restrictions in all sorts of Western countries in particular. And who knows what the next variant's going to be. We could get a Pi variant or the Sigma variant or something, and it could wind up being even more transmissible, right? If we want to talk about the evolution of the virus, I would heavily push back against the notion that it's becoming less lethal, simply because if you look at the trade-off between transmissibility and death and hospitalization rates, even if on an individual level, on any particular Omicron patient, even if they are less likely to get hospitalized and die from Omicron for one person, the aggregate collection of everybody infected by Omicron is going to translate to a lot more hospitalizations and deaths due to how transmissible it is, right? A very small percentage of a large number of cases is still a very large number. So when it comes to that, again, we're in a situation where people are, I think, really almost convincing themselves to try and overcome the COVID fatigue that, Omicron's more mild. In some capacity, scientifically, it is, but it's still not something to just brush off. This is something that absolutely needs to be taken seriously, because it has vast societal impact, even if it doesn't cripple the individual, which it could due to long COVID. Yeah, this is something that could one, overrun the healthcare system, which is happening again right now. Two, make everybody have to call out to work, which cripples the economy, which cripples the supply chain, which cripples a whole lot of stuff. And three, realize that a lot of their jobs really don't care about whether or not their workplace air is safe to breathe. People are quitting in droves because they realize their employers don't care about them, and now everywhere is understaffed. Like, a lot of these economic ripple issues are all the consequence of virus spread. So what we should do ideally from here on out is do what we can to drive case counts down and ideally roll out the Omicron booster. Pfizer's working on it. It should be readily available, ideally with good clinical trial results in hand. That's a big assumption there. If the clinical trial looks good, then it should be widely available. We should ideally, not that this is possible thanks to the Supreme Court now, but I would still like to see nationwide mask and vaccine mandate. I would still like to see restrictions on gathering until case counts go down below a certain level. As far as what that level would be, well, we used to be at that level back before the Delta surge in summer 2021. We were at like 7,000 cases a day nationwide, and Fauci widely touted the 10,000 cases a day number. I would like to see our case counts hover around there for us to start talking about lifting those restrictions in an ideal world. Now, I realize practically a lot of that's not going to happen. One, because of state responses. Two, because of the Supreme Court decision. But that's what's necessary. And we're going to be paying a very, very dire price for what we would otherwise gain in our, ideally newly acquired economic freedom if we were to just adopt or to perpetuate a current strategy in letting it rip and just saying, well, if you get it, you get it. There's vaccines if you want them. Good luck. Like, the individual responsibility mentality from here on out is not viable because it is going to prolong everything, and the economic freedom people are going to regain is going to come at a cost, and that cost, it might be their health.
Well, I would like to give you at least a possibly a little bit of an optimistic look, because I followed the Supreme Court case for OSHA, and in the majority opinion, the reason it was being rejected was twofold. One was there was no limiting principle. In other words, what can't you justify with this principle? There was nothing to limit their power, and it had never been used in this way before, at least the kind of scope of this. And secondly, that even if there were a limiting power, the ability or the power that it granted OSHA to promulgate regulation essentially amounted to a subjugation, or that's not the word I wanted. Congress abdicating its authority to OSHA, which they're not allowed to do. They can't just say, oh, well, we're just going to create this and let them legislate. So they can't really do that. So that was why it was rejected mostly. There's other issues in there too, but that was only stopping OSHA from using the emergency powers to institute this. That doesn't mean Congress couldn't pass a law, couldn't pass legislation to do this. Of course, I already see you going, yeah, like that's really going to happen.
Yeah,
I mean, hypothetically,
you lost me.
right.
Congress passed legislation. You kind of lost me there, but please, I am enjoying this trip in fantasy land.
Democrats do control all three branches of the government.
Yeah, they do. Yeah, I mean, look, my senator is Kirsten Sinema. You can understand why I'm laughing.
Yeah, I can a little, yes, but I mean, I'm just saying that it's not like a national vax mandate. Geez, yes, that's exactly what I'm talking about. National vax mandate isn't still possible. It's not like the Supreme Court completely shut all of that down. They said a regulatory agency doesn't have the authority, nor is there a limiting principle to it, to be able to issue this emergency rule and implement it nationwide. That doesn't mean you can't. There aren't other avenues for the government to try. I doubt they will, because I don't think they believe that they can get it passed. But there are other avenues that could be taken. And I think that one of the things I don't see us really talking about so much, I mean, it's popped up here and there, like the discussion over whether vax mandates are constitutional or not. But I don't see the discussion of whether this is something, a pandemic, and pandemic responses are rightfully the purview of the federal government, or if it should be a state's issue. And I I don't see how you could argue that this isn't a national or a federal government issue, because you don't want the states having a hodgepodge when it comes to a global pandemic. It's affecting the entire world. It's affecting the United States doesn't generally care about the rest of the world, but at least in its own borders, it's affecting everything inside of the United States. So, Washington can have a really good control of it. They can have all of these things in place and say, hey, this is the best. We learned from the last pandemic, and these are the things that we decided were really going to work. We're going to really focus on all of those issues that you want. You got your wish list, and they're going to do it all. And then Idaho says, yeah, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, they're all like, yeah, screw that. We're not going to follow the government. We're not going to do that. We're going to let people live their own lives and make their own choices. And how you can't have a patchwork like that across the country and expect there to be any kind of positive outlook, because the virus doesn't respect state borders and people travel. So I believe that the government should do that, but I don't see that conversation as to whether where is the purview for issuing and promulgating responses to pandemics. I don't see that discussion really being had. Whether I've seen whether or not the government has the right to issue mask mandates nationally or vaccine mandates nationally, but nobody's asked whether they should be able to do that. And I think that they should. But we both agree on that. So
and OSHA's a workaround, right? It's sort of like the state commerce clause to pass. It's closer than state commerce clause. That we're just talking about workers, but nonetheless, it's still like, okay, we can't do what we'd like, which is to affect everybody. So we're going to find kind of an end round, which is 95% of how Washington passes laws. But anyways, I'm sorry. Please, there's just an observation there. So homozygote.
We both agree on that. I think what people want to see is at least the current administration try. Like you said, like that conversation at least doesn't appear to be very public facing if it's occurring at all. So what it would be nice, like the OSHA thing was at least, like you said, a workaround, like an attempt to try. But this shouldn't be the end of the attempts to try. Like there should be, I don't know, if somebody can introduce a bill in Congress and then we can all point the finger at Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema for not doing it because that hurts corporations. And then, I don't know, if there are any other... Again, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, so this is very much out of my realm of knowledge. But, if the CDC has any other, bureaucratic tricks up its sleeve to use its already profound legal authority to try and do something, like I know they have the legal ability to forcibly quarantine any sick person if they really want to, and keep them until they're better or dead. So, at that point,
well, to a point,
the CDC,
there are limitations on that.
Right. But I think that the greater point I'm trying to make here is like people want to see their institutions and their agencies try and fight for them. And that's something that's largely not happening. If this is something that, if we were in a position where the Supreme Court has shot down like 5 different policies, then we can all take a look at the Supreme Court and say, okay, that's where a lot of the problem lies, rather than our collective government administration not really wanting to do anything about the issue. And I think we're both in agreement that we want to try and see the federal government to try and see what they can do, because the federal government is necessary in responding in a pandemic situation.
All right, let me.
When it comes to pandemics,
I want to hear his Andering, and then I'm going to do a couple quick super chats, and then we'll wrap it up. So please, Andering.
Sure.
Yeah, it only makes sense. And when you look at I don't see how. I know there's a lot of very right people that are like, oh, they don't want the government doing anything at all. It's like, that is not the role of the federal government either, to do absolutely nothing. It has a specific role. That role was to do those things that the states either cannot or should not be doing on their own. So this is something that the states cannot, and we don't want them doing on their own. There needs to be a good, strong, coordinated response on a federal level that can be implemented nationwide to be able to control viruses. This particular virus is going to cause a whole hell of a lot of problems, but it's not. It doesn't have the potential. Well, at least currently, does not have the potential to cause the zombie apocalypse. Something like airborne rabies, on the other hand, could usher in the zombie apocalypse, and it'd probably be the closest thing to a zombie apocalypse we could ever see. And that's the virus that I'm more worried about next time. This one, I've had COVID, incredibly mild, almost no symptoms. I would say the worst thing about it was losing my sense of taste and smell. But, I think that we're going to be able to pull out of this eventually. I don't have much hope that anything of significance is going to change. We're going to keep muddling through pretty much exactly the way that we are. There's a lot of people that are just sick of it, and they're eventually just going to get to the point where I'm going back to live my life, and I don't care what the rest of you all do. This is my life, and I'm going to go live it. You want to live in fear and cower in your basement because, oh my God, the COVID's going to get me. Well, then that's up to you. And I'm seeing more, and again, the areas that I frequent are disproportionately conservative compared to many other places in the United States. But that is the overwhelming, and I realize it's anecdotal, but this is national-wide anecdotal. That's where the attitudes are creeping more and more and more too. The more people I talk to, the more people are fed up with this. The more people have said, "Look, I'm just not doing this anymore." There used to be places where masks, and there still are places. Some of the travel centers that still require masks. Just about every, with a few exceptions in states, all of the travel centers still say masks required to enter. Nobody's wearing them. Nobody's enforcing it. And even in those places where they do try and enforce it, you're seeing more and more people are just telling you to fuck off.
Well, I'm seeing that even in Massachusetts. This is liberal Massachusetts, my grocery store, and even with a mask mandate saying you have to, there's now about a third that aren't wearing masks. And I once forgot my mask, and I was like, oh, let me go back and get it. It was in my car. I said, let me go back and get it. I was in for a doctor's appointment. They said, no, don't worry about it. I was like, wait. When I wasn't a medic, it wasn't that kind of doctor. It wasn't like it was like an eye exam. It was for the new glasses, and like, don't worry about it. And I was like, you can't legally say that. But so yeah, Xander, I've seen it too, and I'm in Massachusetts.
Yeah, and I'm seeing this everywhere across the country. I mean, even through, I'm seeing this in Oregon. Oregon and Washington. I think Washington still has a statewide mask mandate for all public areas. I know Oregon does. I think Washington still does. I know they had one. Those two states, that there's only been two places that I've gone into that actually try to enforce it, and even now, they're starting to lose that battle. There's people that are beginning to not enforce it. They're just kind of giving up, and I see this in a lot of places where there's so much fatigue about it, and I think that's where eventually we're headed. Is fewer people are going to be adhering to these, not more. So, what do you think we can actually do, or what do you think what do you think could realistically be done with a population that is growing more and more weary and is less and less likely to follow what the CDC is saying, especially since I have seen the politicization of the CDC. Fewer people, by polling, fewer people believe the CDC actually has science at its base and it's not politically motivated. I mean, all of these things seem to be going in the wrong way as far as being able to handle at least future pandemics, let alone this pandemic. Do you think that it's going to get better, or do you think it's going to get worse?
Oh, you're probably not going to like this answer. I mean, look, that COVID fatigue notwithstanding, that attitude has been omnipresent even since the start of the pandemic. You had people openly protesting in defiance of lockdowns at the very beginning of the pandemic. You had the very large anti-vaccine movement that this country has cultivated over many, many years since the advent of Wakefield et al. Right? We were basically... this pandemic has been the functional culmination of all of this. So that kind of attitude and disposition towards, a lack of desire in complying with masks, vaccines, distancing, anything, that's already been there. And that's been reflected in our abysmal vaccination rate, even before Omicron came on the scene. So, when push comes to shove, right, we very much as a country are succumbing to the notion of rugged American individualism and our obsession, our freedom fetish, in the sense that, I can do whatever I want. Don't tell me what to do. You can do whatever you want. I'll just do me. But, philosophically, when what one person does can affect somebody else in transmitting the virus, that's where we have to really have a conversation about how you're not necessarily free to do whatever you want because you're impinging on somebody else's freedom to literally exist. So at this point, we're only going to have more of that attitude develop as COVID fatigue really starts to set in. And that underlies the necessity for mandates. I don't know if any of these policies are ever going to come to fruition, but, ideally, again, my ideal vision would have been mandates with enforcement from our police state. And I know that's very uncharacteristically authoritarian of somebody who is a self-described leftist, but that's what's necessary. I mean, if you look at the country of Austria, for example, they're in a similar situation. They have a very fervent anti-vaccine movement. They've implemented mandates that ban unvaccinated people from public spaces, and they're literally enforcing that with their police. And there are protests, there are riots, there are people getting arrested, there are people trying to attack the police because they feel like their freedoms are being infringed upon by these policies. So, when push comes to shove, we have to reconcile with the characteristically American brain rot that we've been cultivating for many, many years. So as far as where we go from here, I think the COVID fatigue is going to continue to make things worse. If we get another variant in particular, and I say that because, again, it's very much been established scientifically that immunity wanes over time. If the variants keep mutating and their genetic code continues to differ by large margins in comparison to what we vaccinated against, we're going to be locked in a perpetual boom-bust cycle of spike and then decline and then spike and then decline. We're going to essentially subject everybody in the populace to this. Now, vaccinations are going to make it better. The more people we vaccinate, the more people we boost per whatever the scientific recommendations are based on, what vaccine versions, right? Omicron booster, future variant specific booster, that all is yet to be determined. But if we follow the vaccination recommendations, we can preserve life in terms of keeping people alive. That's how things can get better. If we vaccinate more people, that is going to be objectively better. But ideally, that would be combined with high quality masking, improvements in ventilation, distancing, especially in times like these where case counts are through the roof and our testing capacity is so oversaturated that we're probably undercounting even what we have right now. So vaccination can make things better and these policies can make things better. But when we rely solely on the individual to enact all of this, we are going to embolden and empower the population that never thought any of this was a good idea and was never on board with any of this in the first place. And those are the people that are going to get Omicron reinfections after having had prior COVID. Those are people that might get reinfections with future variants, right? We don't have the ability to predict the future, and we should be abiding by the precautionary principle and trying to limit the spread of the virus. And I would be okay with paying a fair cost for that, even economically, because in the long run, the economy is going to be healthier for it. And more people are not taking all of their disposable income and siphoning it into the American healthcare system, which is for profit, to try and take care of their overwhelmingly high medical bills. So what we can do, again, vaccines, high quality masking, ventilation, distancing, that's how we can make it better. And there is still a possibility for us to make it better. But there are so many holdouts and there's an absence of policy and political willpower to even try and talk about these policies or propose them, that we might get locked into these boom-bust cycles. That's kind of what I think might happen. Now, if we continue to get variants that are more transmissible but not necessarily as lethal as a Delta, then we might not see large swaths of people dying. But we're still going to have issues. And these issues are going to make their impact known on the economy. Those economic outputs of uncontrolled viral spread are going to continue to manifest time and time again. So for the sake of the economy and people's health, stopping the virus spread is objectively the correct thing to do. And we should be doing it. We have the ability to do it. We can do it. We should.
All right, what I want to do is I want to quickly read the super chats. I'm going to ask a brief question that hopefully Homozygote can roll into his sort of final thoughts, and everyone gets their final thoughts, and I think we'll go. I think it's been very productive. And these are for the audience of this show, which tends to lean liberal. This is all, like it's sort of like, hey, this is sort of common sense. Well, it's kind of the dogma of the left, and by dogma I mean that's just what we believe. I don't, whether it's right or wrong. I mean, there's plenty of dogma that's completely accurate, and we should all believe in, but it's something worth examining. And for at least half of this country, these aren't the questions we're hearing. What we're hearing and we're talking about is my freedom and stuff like that. But it's based on these questions. This is what people are asking. So I think I'm very glad we had this discussion. So thank you both. So Quick comment. K.O. Velen said, fatigue, there is no consequences. And if I'm reading that correctly, interpreting it, I think that's one of my favorite points that Endangering had made that I'd never really thought about, which was that, of course, in some ways, this is the nightmare disease because it's not so bad. If this was killing 60% of people who caught it, the government could say, we will pay everyone $1,000 an hour to go to work, and nobody would go to work. People would stay locked in their homes, and people would be perfectly fine with it. So it's this argument over just how bad is it, but it's to this point where people can justify saying, well, it's not that bad. So, that makes it harder, of course, to cope with. So that's an interesting perspective. I'd also like to point out that, of course, what this does is this turns everybody into a weapon. So, if you have COVID, you are now a weapon of some kind, and you don't have really any control over who you hit with it, except for walking around and bumping into people. And everyone you bump into may be fine, and you may hit somebody who's immunocompromised and they're dead, or you hit somebody who's perfectly fine, but they transmit it to somebody who's immunocompromised. So it looks like there should be some broad, just because we do have some control on guns in this country, and you can't go around shooting people. And there is, they say that my freedom stops at the bridge of your nose. And COVID is invisible in that respect. But I am absolutely hitting you on the bridge of the nose if I'm infected with something, and I have at least a reasonable suspicion I could have it, and I, act, which at this point everyone should have a reasonable suspicion. But and then let's see, the question, but well, no, let me do the super chats. I'll ask the question and we'll do the wrap up. So Sister Porpoise, who had opined on her feline, who had a penchant and a taste for the finest calculus homework ever written. And I had said, yeah, it sounds like kind of an excuse to me. Like, I can't say the dog ate it, so I'll be original, say it was the cat. $2 from Sister Porpoise. For the record, I've heard those excuses myself, having taught. I'm sure she has. So have I, and they get original. They're a lot of fun. Ian Davenport, $5, Australian, I think it is dollars. Just a sticker, a little mic drop and bailing there. So Ian said goodbye already, and I didn't want to interrupt the conversation more than I already was. So I wanted to let that. But thank you very much, Ian, for your support. We really appreciate it, and have yourself a marvelous evening. Thank you for your support and for checking in on us. We appreciate it. Jake 4D, again, as always, also, thank you so much for your support. On that note, Homozygote, and now he's going to say, I think he's referring to his real brother, quote, my freedom's brother only got his vaccine because he was required to go to a concert on Christmas. And I think that's how a lot of it works, is if you want to travel and stuff like that. Now that's and that's sort of what OSHA was planning on. And I think that's sort of because a lot of people are just going to do it if that's kind of the vaccine passport thing. And yeah, so there's a theory going around, and so far what we've been seeing kind of plays into that theory, and I'm using theory loosely, so I'll say hypothesis, except I always sound like such a snob to the audience and to everybody else, but I mean hypothesis, I'm going to say theory, that as viruses continue to evolve in the wild, you're going to naturally see them become less deadly, and the reason is because if they become more deadly, they start killing off their hosts kind of too quickly. And so you're going to see things like Omicron. And what's really just going to happen is if we allow this to continue, you're going to see it become less and less lethal. So that's what we saw with Omicron. That's what we can expect going forward. So that's just sort of a popular theory. I have not heard it uttered from any scientists. In fact, I've heard some opinions of scientists, but I'd rather let you, Homozygote, opine on that. But so sort of going forward, I would like to hear sort of a closing remarks from everybody. So Xander, if you could give us a couple of minutes here and just tell us your thoughts, or what your takeaway is going forward, and then we'll go to Homozygote, and I think that'll be about it.
I think that the lack of any kind of real leadership in the beginning, or really through this entire ordeal, has given us the absolute worst of all worlds. I mean, I guess maybe not the worst of, if we'd have just let everything rip, a lot more people would have died. So I guess it could have been worse, but as far as for doing something, we seem to because we half-assed everything, tried to split the baby down the middle, we ended up with the same kind of damage to the economy, which already couldn't really withstand, wasn't strong enough to be able to withstand shocks like that to begin with. And we still ended up with a high, death count, and we're finding out about long COVID, and that's going to be, I think, a more pressing issue going forward into the future. So I'm left with everybody seems incompetent. So what do we do about it? Is there anything we can do about it? And I don't see a viable way, not with a virus like this. I think it's going to take a far more significant virus, with a much more significant lethality rate before we actually do anything to fix these problems. And I think we're just going to keep lingering on the way we're lingering on. And both sides are going to yell at each other. You're going to have, those on the right are going to say, look, pandemic's essentially over. There's a vaccine available. If you want to get a vaccine, go get a vaccine. They're, great. They have low side effects. They're reasonably safe. They're reasonably effective at preventing serious sickness and death. And if you get, your proper boosters, gives you a significant immunity as well. Otherwise, all the rest of you can just go screw off. And then you have, people on the left side that are like, no, we really need to get the federal government involved. We need to put in these mandates, and we need to knock this thing on its ass. And we can do it, but all you people, some centrists and people on the right are stopping this. And so I think we're just going to be bickering back and forth, and I don't think anything's actually going to get done.
All right, thank you. Homozygote, any sort of final thoughts?
Yeah, I certainly have several. I would say, I think in response to, I don't know if it was a super chat or someone saying, the trajectory of the virus is sort of trending towards more mild. This is a myth that is very commonly perpetuated. This is something that people kind of think about with diseases that have very high lethality rates. Ebola really comes to mind as like the quintessential example of this myth, right? People think that the virus doesn't want to kill people because then it can't transmit to other people. But this is not true for a lot of infectious diseases in general, right? If we want to talk about COVID, the virus transmits long before death. One person can infect a whole bunch of other people long before that person dies, or even people who infected them die. So we're not in a situation where we can really functionally say that it's becoming more mild. We can take a look at the existence of the alpha and delta variants in particular. Those variants became more transmissible and more virulent in comparison to the original version of the virus. So the evolutionary trajectory of COVID is not something that we can necessarily predict. As we learn more about the evolutionary origins of Omicron, which almost functions a lot differently in terms of how it gets into cells and the severity of disease that it causes, we'll learn more and have a better idea of the evolutionary capacity of COVID. But it's really important for us to realize that what we're seeing right now in this pandemic, this is not like the seasonal flu or RSV or any other common cold virus that we get, right? We're looking at a virus whose evolutionary impact is spitting out new variants that are capable of all sorts of different things biologically speaking. We're not seeing the typical, building on the latest and greatest iteration of the virus, and then we vaccinate and the virus mutates around a vaccine, kind of like the seasonal flu. We're seeing the virus churn out variants that are widely capable and differentially capable compared to each other. So from here on out, I think people really should function with the mentality that COVID is still very much real, right? You are still at risk. Even if you are vaccinated, you could still technically get it, especially if your immunity has worn off. You should want to prevent that for yourself. You should want to prevent that for other people. And you should want to prevent that so society can get back to some greater degree of normal. So the tools that we have available to do that, getting vaccinated and boosted, if you haven't done that already, wearing high quality masks, distancing, and ideally improving ventilation where possible. I realize that the individual doesn't have all that much control over ventilation ability, in their school or their workplace or anything like that. So you, the individual, can do what you can And I would also encourage people to advocate for stronger federal action, because we have reached a point where it is the federal government that has to take the required actions to truly deliver us to the end of this. An end where case counts are not 5 to 10% of the US population per day and causing unforetold amounts of sickness and disability. This is a future that is still achievable for us, but we now, unfortunately, have to be the biggest advocates for that future. So keep that in mind as things continue to wax and wane in terms of cases and potential variants from here on out, right? Especially in the face of Omicron variant BA.2 that is now sweeping countries that just dealt with the original Omicron in the first place. We're already rinsing and repeating Omicron despite it just showing up in the middle of November. So this is still something that everybody needs to be aware of and do what they can to address.
And we're going to.
I have one disclaimer before you close off.
I'm sorry. What was that?
I said I have one disclaimer before you close off
one
the
disclaimer.
show.
All right. So I'll do my closing in a second. I do want to say we're going to change policies with Homozygote here. We're not going to be inviting you on in the show anymore. What I'd like you to do is just when there's a week when there isn't a new variant, let us know so we have something special to report. All right. So Humanist Swede 20 SEK. That's Swedish currency, but I have no idea what it is. It could be 6 cents. It could be $1,000. I will say thank you so much for your support as always. And you'd think, because you've super chatted before, you'd think I'd know the currency, but thank you so much. Sweden expects crowd immunity within 2 to 3 weeks, and if they get that, and of course they had an interesting approach. Of course, they kept, I think, if I recall, they kept the schools open, but sort of shut down everything else. And we can always get into that at some other point. But thank you very much for that. I do have something I would very much like to say, but let's have Isandering say what he wanted to say, and then I'll give my final thoughts, and we'll be done.
The only disclaimer that I have is for, and this kind of goes for any contentious topic. Many of the arguments and views expressed are not necessarily those of the hosts in time or any of the guests. We're trying to make a informative and teachable program for you to learn. So don't yell at everybody because views and arguments are made. They're not necessarily personally held by, like I said, any of the guests or in time as a channel.
Well, and let's take it on a step further than that. I appreciate that, but let's go a step further than that and point out that also a lot of us are verbal processors. Hawthorne said, "How do I know what I mean to say until I read what I write?" And as a writer who doesn't know what he means to say until he's finished the book, and then he has to sit back and say, "Oops, I wanted to say something else. I better rewrite the fucker." And that's actually a pretty common thing. How do I know what I'm thinking unless I hear what I say? I process by talking about things and by asking questions. And I will tell you, we need to ban that cow guy. I don't like his attitude. And I will tell you this, it's like oftentimes just banting around ideas and, we're having a rebellion. Just banting around ideas, you get hit for, well, Jesus, you really think that? Well, I'm asking that. I'm thinking about that. And we have talked about a lot of very difficult topics. We've talked about woke culture and what I believe to be some genuine, and we won't get into the definition of that right now, but we've talked about how far has trans activism gone too far? I think all of us are for trans rights, but is there a backlash? And these are difficult questions, and I am very proud to be on a show where we are not canceling people as long as they're asking them genuinely. And again, they don't even have to believe them, as long as there are people who really do and who need a voice to have that genuinely answered. And Homozygote is here answering these questions so that people can watch this show, and if they don't have the answers, somebody is talking to them, and I'd much rather be a part of that. So I sincerely appreciate Isandering coming out and making these arguments, because they're not particularly popular. They're not popular in particular with the people I like to hang with, because again, I'm north of the Mason-Dixon line. I don't have the advantage of going across country and hitting basically every single state in the 3-day period, for fuck's sake, and learning what other people are thinking and talking about. And we are not the only ones in the room. And the second we start to say that and act that way, COVID fatigue is going to get a hell of a lot worse and is going to be one of our smaller problems. And that's where we're headed, which is people can't talk and express ideas that are unpopular without being called stupid or X, Y, and Z. So I'm extremely glad to thank you, both of you, for having this discussion. This was not our most, let's get down into the nuts and bolts. But these are questions that people are asking and they need to be answered. So I sincerely appreciate that. I will say, I'm glad I'm not in polio at the time of polio, and we forget just how far this country has come. And we live in still, and the numbers are going down. Yeah, okay. The most prosperous time in human history, the longest life expectancy, the greatest number of countries with the lowest amount of poverty, the least amount of human suffering, the greatest amount of free time and things to do with that free time, because you have a lot of free time in jail, but that doesn't really count now, does it? And especially in America, we have decided that because this is America and because we're the greatest country in the world, what that means is we don't need to suffer. No, what that means is we're willing to suffer more than everyone else. That's what it meant during World War II, that we're going to involve ourselves in a war on the other side of the world because that's what has to be done. That's what the greatest country in the world does. And we've forgotten how to sacrifice, and all we remember now is that, well, I love this country and I would die for this country, but while I'm already forced to wear pants, a shirt, and all these other things when I go into McDonald's, asking me to wear a piece of cloth over my face is fascism. And the only antidote to that is to have these discussions and to try to do it honestly, and perhaps for me to not get quite so outraged about that kind of thing. But on the flip side, that's something to be outraged about. We are all in this together and everybody's suffering. I want to be back to normal, and I feel the urge every time I go out to say I'm triple vaxxed. Is it going to really hurt if I don't? It sucks, and this is not what I envisioned my life like. And I'm watching people I know die of COVID, die of other things, old age and all of these other things, and I'm feeling untethered because so much in my life changes so rapidly. So I want to go back. Courage is doing what's right. If this is ever to be the greatest country in the world that it says it is, don't sit there and say COVID's a problem and just accept it. But maybe open up a book and find out. You don't have to get a PhD. Talk to people who know. My government's lied to me a lot more than I ever thought they would. They're still a better source of information than the Russian government, than the Chinese government. And there are still ways to make decisions based on some semblance of reality. I may never know the truth, but I've seen people get hurt by this. I've seen people die by this, and this is affecting a lot of people, and this has to be dealt with. And pretending like it's not there is the easiest thing to do and the absolute worst thing we could possibly do. It's what I want to do. It's number one on my agenda of things to do is pretend it ain't there. I can't. So thank you all very much for watching. I do want to point out one final thing as we close, and we're going to wrap this up. But again, thank you to both of our guests for coming. I really appreciate it. This is once again just a kind of show where it's like, okay, let's at least offer some pushback, no matter what we think, and we'll see what we got. And hopefully, to the people who really seriously oppose this, which I don't think anybody on this panel or in this audience does, hopefully they feel they were properly represented, and maybe they got an answer that will get them thinking. I don't think anyone's going to be converted. But start thinking and move forward a little bit, because everybody needs your help. I need your help. You need mine. And I think that's why Zandring, who is a genuine conservative, and I'm proud to say a friend, also has nearly knocked my socks off by saying, yes, the federal government should be doing this, because that's basically something I've almost never heard come out of his mouth. So having said that, BBC has reported today, as I understand it, and this is thanks to Titan, so thank you for kicking this up. The daily U.S. death toll from COVID, the average death toll today, is now back at where it was at the height of the Delta variant. Honestly, that's got to be, I think, a little older, because last I saw it was, I haven't checked the numbers in a while, but last I checked them was about a week ago, and it was set to exceed that in a couple of days. So, but we are at least there, if not higher. So thank you again, Homozygote. Thank you very much, Zandring. Tomorrow, overtime, and we will be discussing, I think, primarily the Ukraine, because that's getting a little nerve-wracking for anybody who's got a pulse. And next week, we will have on Dr. Oh my God, he likes to go by his first name, and now I want to say Dr. Tom. Oh God, he's going to give me a hard time. But we had him on once before to discuss fallacies. He's written a book cataloging sort of all of the human fallacies. He's a delight to have and really interesting. And we're going to talk to him a bit more about some of his fallacies because he discussed a lot with us. Apparently, one of mine made it in, the Tinkerbell effect. He's going to be adding that one, we're going to talk more about fallacies and. Maybe see if we can maybe do a little pushback there, although I think we all sort of agree that the human brain is in its urge for efficiency over accuracy. We have some issues, and our response to this pandemic is absolutely the highlight. Anyways, today, at least what I have here, says from the BBC, daily death toll from COVID now matches that from Delta. Thank you both. Thank you to our audience. Thank you again very much for the super chats. If you like this stream, please hit the like button, please subscribe, and leave us a comment. And if it's something that we can pass on to Homozygote for you, please let us know. We will do that. You can also find him on his channel, which we have dropped his Twitch channel just in the live chat. Or as Andrew and I will be happy to address your comments. We like to answer what you guys say. So hit us up, and we will see you all tomorrow. Thank you so much.
Good night.
Welcome to In Time. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications. We read all of your comments, and if you like this video, please don't forget to share.